Welcome back to the guided video tour of this document, the Timeline.pdf spreadsheet. So we've completed the segment of the timeline from creation until the promise, when Abram is 75 years old and God calls him out of Haran. Now the Lord had said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you." So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Now in Acts 7, Stephen will say that God appeared to Abram back in Ur and said to him, "Get out of your country and from your relatives and come to a land that I will show you." But as we learned in the last video, many of the things that Stephen says while giving his defense do not agree with the written history in Genesis and Exodus, and we discovered the reason for this. We won't go into all that again now, but you can watch the previous video in the guided tour playlist, and also the oral Torah video, and they will help us to identify when non-historical Aggadah is being quoted in the New Testament, so we don't get confused when it contradicts or adds to the revealed history in the Old Testament. Up to this point, the timeline has been assembled using the paternal lineage to Christ provided in Genesis chapters 5 and 11. Adam lived 130 years and begot a son, Seth. Seth lived 105 years and begot Enosh, etc., all the way until Abraham. However, if we remember, we're not told when Shem was born. Instead, we're given 4 synchronisms for reconciling the timeline in Genesis 11:10, when God tells us that Shem was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. Similar synchronisms will be given elsewhere in the Bible that allow us to verify the accuracy of the timeline. The next section of the timeline goes from when Abram is 75 years old and he leaves Haran until the Israelites leave Egypt. We're told that they came out on the 15th day of the first month, exactly 430 years from when Abram left Haran, to the very day. Along with these 2 anchor points in the timeline, we are given many details that help us fill in the chronology between these 2 points, and they will help us to understand how all the events fit together. For example, we know that the 430-year section can be broken in half: 215 years in Canaan and 215 years in Egypt. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran, and this was the 367th year after the flood, as we note on our chart as well. The first column lists the consecutive years from creation, and the second column lists the consecutive years from the flood. So Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. Then 25 years later, he's 100 years old, and Isaac is born. Then 60 years later, Isaac is 60 years old, and Jacob is born. 130 years later, Jacob is 130 years old when they entered Egypt. So we can see quite easily that 215 years passed before they went into Egypt. This 215-year period can be broken down further with the many chronological and geographical details provided in Scripture. For instance, we are told that Sarai gave Hagar to Abram after dwelling 10 years in the land of Canaan. Hagar fled when Sarai mistreated her, but she returned and bore Ishmael to Abraham when he was 86 years old. We can verify the accuracy because each row of this spreadsheet represents a year, and once we have a person's age confirmed at any known point, we can know their age at any given point on the timeline as well. When Abram was 99 years old, he was circumcised, and Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised. God gives circumcision as a sign of the covenant and changes Abram's name to Abraham. Sarai's name is also changed to Sarah, and to their disbelief they are told that Sarah will bear a son. This is also the year that Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. And the next year is when Isaac is born, Abraham being 100 years old. Now we're not told directly that Isaac was 5 years old when he was weaned, but we know he was, because Ishmael mocking Isaac begins the 400-year affliction prophesied in Genesis 15:13 and later referenced in Acts 7 verse 6 and Galatians 4:28 and 29. It may seem unusual for us today that a child would nurse until 5 years old, but the Talmud states that a child should be allowed to nurse up until the age of 5. And the Jewish Agency for Israel says that in Talmudic times, it was customary to celebrate a child's weaning any time from 18 months to 5 years. Even today, there are groups of people that advocate letting a child breastfeed until they no longer show interest, and they report some children nursing until the age of 5 or 6. Ishmael was 19 years old at the time, and it's not hard to imagine him mocking his younger half-brother, possibly for taking so long to advance to solid food. So we continue down, and we can see when Terah died and when Sarah died. This is a very unique point in Scripture because we are given Sarah's age at death. We're also given an extremely large amount of details regarding the burial place that Abraham purchased. Many details that are repeated throughout Scripture until Jacob is finally buried there also. If you watch this Abraham video linked here, you'll notice the large amount of details regarding the cave of the field of Machpelah and the seemingly unnecessary amount of times that these details are repeated, to the point that we should wonder why. When we examine some of the statements by Stephen in Acts 7, it becomes clear that some of the details he provided are in direct conflict with what's recorded in Genesis, and that the amount of repeated details in Genesis assure us that the Genesis account is accurate. This should then lead us to investigate why Stephen says what he says in Acts 7. We addressed this some in the last video, and the Abraham and Oral Torah videos examine this issue in more detail as well. Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, and he was 60 years old when Jacob and Esau were born. Jacob and Esau were 15 years old when their grandfather Abraham passed away. We know this because once somebody is synchronized on the timeline, in this case when they were born, we can know their age at any other point on the timeline as well. And this is how we know how old Jacob was when he tricked his father and took Esau's blessing. Although it will take a little more investigating to see this one. So we scroll down and we can see Jacob entered Egypt in the 582nd year after the flood. And we can see that corresponding on our chart. It's at this point that Pharaoh asked Jacob how old he is, and Jacob answered 130 years. We may wonder what Pharaoh's reason was for asking, but the real question we should ask is, why did God choose to record this seemingly trivial statement in Scripture? Notice also in Genesis 45, after Joseph revealed himself to his brothers, he tells them, "For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting." Then for good measure, he repeats in verse 11, "For there are still 5 years of famine." So we can now start working backwards to the first year of plenty, where we are once again given somebody's age. Joseph is 30 years old when he enters Pharaoh's service. So now we know that 9 years later, he's 39 years old, and Jacob, being 130 years old, minus 39, now we know that Jacob was 91 years old when Joseph was born. So we scroll up to when Jacob is 91. And since Joseph was born after the 14 years spent in Haran, we can now know when Jacob pretended to be Esau and took his brother's blessing. Then he fled to Haran and began working for his uncle Laban. It was about this time that Esau left the land of his brother's inheritance and moved to Seir and would become the father of the Edomites. He will meet his brother again after Jacob spends 20 years in Haran. Jacob worked 7 years for Rachel, but he was tricked and given Leah instead. He then worked another 7 years for Rachel, and it's during this time that 11 sons and 1 daughter were born to him. We can know fairly accurately when each of them were born because Leah gave birth to 7 of those kids during these 7 years. So there's not much wiggle room in the chronology, especially when we consider that after Judah, she stopped having kids for a short time and gave her maid Zilpah to Jacob. So Gad would have been born to Zilpah near the end of the 4th year, and Asher would have been conceived shortly after. It's at this point we are given a new chronological tool in the Scriptures. We are told that Reuben, who would have been about 3.5 years old at the time, found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah, and she conceived a son Issachar shortly after. The chronological timestamp that we are given in Genesis 30:14 says that Reuben found the mandrakes in the days of wheat harvest. So now we know Issachar was conceived in the spring and born in the winter. This is our introduction to some of the seasonal clues that are given in Scripture that allow us to pinpoint chronology. There will be many clues like this throughout the rest of the Bible, and we'll notice them and their importance as we continue to progress through this timeline. So at the end of the 20 years, Jacob packs up the family and all his possessions and leaves Haran without telling his uncle. He gets a 3-day head start, but Laban comes after him and catches him 7 days later in the mountains of Gilead. As they argued, Jacob told him, "I have been in your house 20 years. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock." Once again confirming the chronology. They part ways and Jacob prepares to meet his brother Esau. After their meeting, Esau returns to Edom and Jacob goes to Succoth and builds shelters for his livestock. We are also told that Jacob built a house there, but if not for the chronological details given later in chapter 37, we might think Jacob moved on to Shechem, and then to Bethel, and then to his father's house in Hebron shortly after, when in fact he spent 10 or 11 years in Succoth before moving to Shechem. Genesis 36:7 tells us that Jacob and Esau's possessions were too great and that they could not dwell together because the land would not support them because of their livestock. The reading in chapter 36 may sound like this was the reason for Esau initially leaving and settling in Mount Seir, but Jacob had fled before Esau moved away, and Jacob did not acquire his abundance of livestock until after 20 years in Haran. While speaking of when he first fled to Haran, Jacob said, "I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan." So Jacob's flocks are now grazing in Canaan on the west side of the Jordan, while he maintains his house in Succoth. As his sons got older, he would send them out with the animals throughout the land of Canaan to graze. When Joseph was 17 years old, he was feeding the flock with his brothers, and he brought back a bad report about them. Later, when the brothers were feeding their father's flock near Shechem, Jacob sent Joseph up from the valley of Hebron to check on them. When he got there, a man told him they had moved on to Dothan. This is where they took his coat of many colors and sold him to a band of Ishmaelite traders that took him to Egypt. Jacob believed that Joseph had been killed by a wild beast, and it's at this point he packs up the family and leaves his house in Succoth. When they arrived in Shechem, Jacob purchased a plot of ground to pitch his tent, and this is where Dinah is violated by Shechem the son of Hamor, and he wanted to marry Dinah. Dinah was 17 to 18 years old at the time, the same age as her brother Joseph. So they moved on to Bethel, and as they continued south and were a short distance from Bethlehem, Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin. We don't know the exact timing, but Benjamin would have been about 19 or 20 when they entered Egypt, in the 582nd year from the flood. In the next video, we'll cover the section from when they entered Egypt until the Exodus. You can download and share this printable chart, as well as the complete Timeline PDF spreadsheet, by clicking the links in the description of this video. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you here next time. May God bless you in your studies.